Chinese telecom company Huawei has been charged with racketeering and stealing U.S. trade secrets. But how serious is Huawei's threat to America? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Huawei, the Chinese telecom company that brings us together, because both Trump and Obama agreed that it was a threat to the U.S. The Justice Department has charged Huawei with racketeering and stealing trade secrets. But despite warnings from U.S. intelligence agencies, some of America's allies still want to make deals with Huawei. Is the Huawei threat really that serious? I sat down to talk about Huawei with economic expert and policy director with America First Policies, Curtis Ellis. He was also senior policy advisor to Trump's presidential campaign in 2016. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So I know you've called Huawei essentially the espionage arm of the Chinese Communist Party, right, masquerading as a telecom company. Mm-hmm. What are you basing that on?
Well, they have backdoors built into all of their equipment so that the Chinese government, the Chinese military, the Chinese Communist Party can basically tap into all of the data and information that flows over Huawei networks. So if you have an internet or a telecom network using Huawei equipment, you can be sure that the Chinese government can tap into it at will. That's espionage. That's cyber espionage. So it's that simple. And there is no other way to put it. To look at it any other way is just delusional. We know that the Chinese government has a law, the civil military fusion law, that requires any Chinese company to cooperate with the Chinese military. This is a communist dictatorship. They call it socialist if you want, socialist with Chinese characteristics. They want complete control over everything. There is no such thing as an independent business entity in China. No such thing.
Well, so I know the NSA has been accused of asking U.S. telecom companies to build backdoors. Mm-hmm. How is what China is doing with Huawei different from that? Well,
one big difference is the United States government is not the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party has a far different agenda than the U.S. government. The U.S. government still, at its best, adheres to the ideals of Western values, individual liberty, privacy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. At its worst, the U.S. government aspires to those ideals. The Chinese Communist Party has no desire and no illusion about even recognizing those ideals. So you're looking at an organization, the Chinese Communist Party, that is intent on staying in power, accruing, acquiring, and holding on to as much power in its own hands as it can, and it aspires to ideals of the collective above the individual, no such thing as private property, no such thing as individual liberty or individual aspiration. Those are the people who are going to be having access to all the information that flows over Huawei networks.
Is what Huawei is doing, is that typical for other Chinese companies?
Well, as I said, the Chinese law says that all Chinese companies must accede to the demands of the Chinese government. So if the Chinese government asks, let's say, a Chinese bank to turn over the financial records of its customers, it must do so. It can't say no.
I got to get out of that Chinese bank.
Yeah, there you go. And let's look at it further. Every Chinese, we're told that the Chinese government or its industrial espionage outfits are stealing hundreds of millions of dollars of American intellectual property every year. So how many of these companies are essentially selling stolen goods? These Chinese companies are selling stolen goods.
I know the U.S. Justice Department has just charged Huawei with racketeering and stealing trade secrets. Practically speaking, what does that mean?
Well, it means that if you're Cisco and you're building internet routers, Huawei is stealing your designs, copying your designs, building its own routers using your research, using the fruits of your intellectual exploration, making copies of it and selling it probably for less money because it didn't have to go through all the expense, blood, sweat, and toil of designing it and coming up with these designs on its own. So, plus it's receiving government subsidies so it can underbid legitimate companies like Cisco. It can sell that router for less and obtain contracts.
So will this charge affect U.S. policy towards Huawei?
Well, it certainly has already begun affecting U.S. policy towards Huawei. We are asking our allies not to use Huawei equipment as they build out their 5G networks. We are looking at limiting sales of component parts to Huawei. We don't want to enable this company to carry out its malicious activities. While everybody's focused on the trade deals and selling soybeans to China, there's a vast spectrum of activities that the U.S. government is looking at, a vast spectrum of interrelations with China that we're re-examining. A lot of the premises that underlie our current relationships with China are now really, I'd say, called into question, to put it euphemistically. There was always this premise that the more we engage with China, the more they would become like us. They would become more like us. They would respect liberty, they would respect private property, they would open up their system, they would become more peaceful. What we've seen instead is they become more prosperous and acquire more Western technology. They're moving in the opposite direction. They're becoming a techno-totalitarian state. They're militarizing. They're stealing everything that they can't buy or that we don't give them. So under the Phase 1 deal, they're supposed to address some of these intellectual property theft issues, and they're supposed to purchase more American goods and services, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on outside the realm of trade, which we're looking at. For example, Huawei. For example, the FBI says it has 1,000 investigations open across the country of Chinese espionage. Every field agency of the FBI in America has investigations into Chinese espionage activities. So that's not going to be covered by any trade agreement. And the administration has made it very clear that they're not linking the two. You know, we can do business with China. We can, they can buy our soybeans. We can sell them certain goods of a non-military sensitive nature. But we're not going to say, well, now we're going to play nice and make believe that you're not doing something wrong over here. We did business with the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. They had nuclear missiles pointed at us. We knew they had spies trying to infiltrate and influence and, you know, plant moles and all kinds of things. We still would sell them wheat, and we'd still do all kinds of other business with them. Occidental Petroleum, Arm & Hammer, was a famous industrialist who famously did business with Russia. The fact that we knew they were spying on us and wanted to, as Nikita Khrushchev said, "We will bury you." We knew they wanted to bury us, but we said, okay, well, we'll still take their money.
So the U.S., both the Trump administration and the Obama administration, have warned about Huawei. Do you think that's been taken seriously?
It's being taken more seriously now than ever. I really had questions about the Obama administration taking this stuff seriously. Look, so many of the apparatchiks in Washington, in both parties, have been compromised one way or another
100%.
By Chinese influence operations. I'm not saying that they signed up for the Chinese Communist Party. They don't even know how they've been compromised. The buying off Americans on both sides of the aisle. Albright Associates, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, her company's made just tens of millions of dollars advising companies on how to move to China and how to do business in China. Dianne Feinstein's driver was a Chinese spy. Her husband has made money investing in China. You just go down the line. Henry Kissinger. You've got all these Wall Street guys that have made fortunes investing in China, directing investment into China, and now you've heard the stories, it's gone down the line of, it's infiltrated so far that now pension funds, the California state pension funds.
And so you think this is sort of held back, even though the Obama administration and the Trump administration have been pushing warnings about Huawei, that attitude has blocked?
There's bureaucratic inertia. Look, there's basic human nature. Nobody wants to admit they're wrong, right? Oh man,
Certainly.
I was so wrong about that. The basic human nature of not wanting to admit they're wrong, close their eyes, let's keep doing things the way we were doing, because I don't want to admit that I believed the Chinese Communist Party. They were lying to me for all these years, and I was a fool to believe it. Nobody wants to say that. In addition, you have bureaucratic inertia. There's huge bureaucracies in the Pentagon and elsewhere, other agencies of the U.S. government, that are still proceeding along those old premises that as we get closer to China, as they develop and become more prosperous, they will become more American. They will become more Western.
Absolutely. If we give money to a totalitarian communist regime, they'll become a democracy.
Right. Countries, I mean, you hear the truncated version of this is countries that trade with each other don't go to war with each other. Well, tell that to the Ukrainians. Ukraine and Russia were the two largest trading partners. Before World War I, France and Germany were the two largest trading partners. They went to war. I mean, this is like this economic reductionism, this economism that human nature can be reduced to dollars and cents on a spreadsheet. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, and a lot of people say, you know, we are trading, the U.S. is trading with China,
right.
But still, many other actions can only be described as a type of warfare.
Well, in the Chinese military strategy, warfare goes beyond the battlefield. The doctrine is the best general defeats the enemy without taking the battlefield. They see the economic crippling of America and acquiring the productive assets, the technology and the factories of America, acquiring them, moving them to China. That is a form of warfare.
And Huawei is a part of this?
And Huawei is definitely a part of this. Look, if a Chinese army invaded America, went to Silicon Valley, and took all the factories, took all the research labs, and took the people and moved them to Mongolia or moved them to Manchuria and set those factories up, we would recognize that as an act of war and the looting of America. If Chinese capital and Chinese influence gets Wall Street to counsel Silicon Valley to move its research operations into China and to hand over its innovation, research, and technology to Chinese partners, the end result is the same.
Well, we just make some money off of it.
And Wall Street's made some money. They've been bought off. China gets the capital. And you've got think tanks like the Cato Institute saying, oh, this is wonderful. It's free trade. It's free market operation. So therefore it's good. Because you see, again, you have this ideology that says all that matters is the money. There are no such thing as nation states. There's no such thing as culture. There's no such thing as values, cultural values. It just all comes down to how many widgets can we make, how many widgets can we consume, how many widgets can we acquire, and that's all that matters. And it's a very reductionist way of looking at life. It's devoid of humanity, and the things that I would hold say make living worthwhile.
So what does it mean for the U.S. if its allies, like the U.K. or other European countries, use Huawei to build parts of its telecom or 5G networks?
Well, unfortunately, too many people in positions in government don't understand how technology works. And that if Huawei equipment is in any part of the network, it will have access to all parts of the network. So if Huawei equipment, if our allies use Huawei equipment, they're basically all of the information that flows over those networks, and in the 5G network, that's basically everything, could be spied on, monitored, influenced by someone in Beijing. Now look, 5G networks are going to link devices, power plants, electrical grids, ATM machines, not just telephones, everything. So what if you shut down the power grid? What if, let's say, China moves in, Beijing decides to move on Taiwan, right? And simultaneously, somebody gets a message in Washington. You can let this happen, or you will lose power in East Los Angeles, North Philadelphia, Atlanta, and Dade County, and it'll happen on the first of the month when the food stamp benefits are electronically delivered. The SNAP, the supplemental nutrition, it's no longer stamps anymore, it's an electronic card that automatically are replenished. They won't be replenished, so there will be no power, there will be no food, and what do you think is going to happen in your inner cities on that day, right? Or there will be no power to hospitals. There'll be no power to the emergency room, to the intensive care unit.
And so having the UK have part of its system, 5G system, built by Huawei, could have that effect on the US?
Well, no, I'm saying if we were to have Huawei equipment inside the US, that ultimatum could be delivered. But, okay, Germany's looking at this, like how vulnerable will we be if we have Huawei equipment here? They haven't made the decision yet. The British, maybe their health system's so bad already that they don't care. I suppose you would take it to the point of, well, do you want to see this, the United States would be given this ultimatum, will destabilize all of Europe. You know, the British banking system, the City of London will go down, and all of the finance flows that goes through the City of London will be affected, and that'll have a ripple effect through Wall Street and around the world.
Well, some people argue that the U.S. is certainly not offering any 5G alternatives.
Right.
So for many people, it feels like, well, it's Huawei or the highway.
No, it's Huawei or Nokia and Ericsson. Nokia and Ericsson have 5G alternatives. And it's very interesting. Why are the British not going for Nokia and Ericsson? Why are the Germans not going for the Swedes and the Danes, right? This is, and now the United States government is saying maybe we should invest some money into Nokia and Ericsson to develop the 5G alternative to Huawei. You get the impression that the Swedes are sitting there and say, "Hey, I'm here. Look at me. You know, what are you saying? There's no alternative. I'm sitting right here." What's going on with that?
Some people make the argument that the only reason the U.S. is going after Huawei is because it's seen as a major rival to U.S. tech and telecom companies. What would you say to that argument?
Well, we just said that the United States, amazingly, has no alternative for IG. There is no American company that can producing 5G equipment. So for anybody to say we're going after Huawei because it's a competitor to America, that just is false right there. The alternative to Huawei is Nokia and Ericsson. The problem with Huawei is not that there's an American competitor. The problem with Huawei is that it's the espionage arm of the People's Liberation Army. They're entirely compromised. We know they have backdoors in their equipment that can funnel all the information that passes over its networks to Beijing, and that they have been blatantly stealing intellectual property, buying off engineers from rival competitors, doubling, tripling their salary, come work for us, and then violate the non-disclosure agreement that you signed with your previous employer not to disclose their trade secrets. That's what's the matter with Huawei.
And final question, do you think with the U.S. putting so much pressure on Huawei, the Chinese Communist Party will try to retaliate?
The Chinese Communist Party takes nothing lying down. They've threatened Germany. They've told German companies, they've told like BMW, well, that's a nice factory you have outside of Shanghai. I hate to see something bad happen to it. Maybe you ought to have your government buy Huawei equipment. So yes, they're already flashing the dagger, threatening retaliation against anyone who doesn't toe the line. You have to wonder, they've got their equipment in place in various countries around the world, in the developing world. What kind of goods do they have on the leaders of some of these kleptocracies in Africa? What kind of goods do they have on high officials or bankers, high government officials or high industry officials in places like Ethiopia? Or I'm just pulling this out of my hat. I don't know if they even have their equipment installed in Ethiopia. There's blackmail that could be going on that we don't even know about. And think about this. No American company ever voluntarily, unless it's forced to, even discloses when it's hacked. It's very rare. I mean, we've heard about Experian, we heard about Marriott, we've heard about a couple other breaches. But virtually every American company, it's been reported, has been hacked, has been the victim of a cyber attack. They generally don't release this information because it materially affects their earnings. It could have a bad impact on their stock price, makes the executives look bad. It's like, you didn't have the systems in place to guard against this? What the hell are you doing, right? So they don't reveal this all the time. You have to wonder, what kind of goods does the Chinese Communist Party have on how many executives and how many companies? So retaliation, the retaliation could be going on already in the form of extortion or blackmail.
All right, thank you very much for joining me today and telling us about Huawei.
Thank you.